you're only crushing systemic DHT by 70%. There's a residual 30% there that's being totally unaccounted for. And then on top of that, you still have all the testosterone and that massive spike in scalp testosterone that is being unaccounted for as well. What's up guys, Derek, moreplatesmoredates.com. Today we're going to be talking about RU58841 versus Finasteride. So obviously this is a commonly asked question and comparison that is made, and I've been asked for a while now to make this video. It's been on my to-do list, and people want to know what's more effective, what's better and why, what's going to cause more side effects, what's what is the more efficacious option for hair loss prevention. So one thing I did want to show you guys before I kind of just elaborate on what I personally think is a study that put them head to head. So there's not a lot of data on Finasteride versus RU head to head. Obviously, this is pretty much one of the only studies you can actually look at that really show straight up the efficacy of one against the other in the exact same controlled setting. So like in a clinical model, not anecdotally, because obviously even I've done tons of stuff where I've controlled for variables and compared them, and I have a good conclusion as to what is better and why. But obviously clinical data is a bit more useful for people who want to see the absolute all controlled variables with the exact same dosages, ensuring purity of the compounds, ensuring everything is controlled for with no variables that could screw with the result. Now keep in mind this is an animal model, but regardless of that, a lot of this stuff translates to humans at the end of the day, and these both these compounds have been tested in humans, and we do see similar outcomes in a practical application. But so head to head, Finasteride at 1 milligram per kilogram per day was given for 6 months. RU58841 was applied either in a 5% solution or a 0.5% solution. So if you've looked into RU before, that the common starter dose is typically, most people are using like a 5% strength solution, so that's about 50 milligrams per milliliter. And if you have a 0.5% solution, that's only 5 milligrams per milliliter. And then a vehicle was also tested with nothing in it. So this is like basic, and also there were animals that received placebo as opposed to Finasteride. So there's a control for each of these as well. So basically what they did was they took skin biopsies at 0 and 6 months for Finasteride and 0 and 4 months for RU to assess follicular miniaturization. So the populations of anagen follicles and vellus follicles and how much they enlarged, exactly what happened. So it says here in the study, the populations of anagen follicles and vellus follicles enlarged to terminal size were compared to those in pre-treatment stages. Anagen follicles increased an average of 88% with Finasteride and 103% with RU 5%, and growth of vellus follicles to terminal size was 12% with Finasteride and 26% with RU 5%. So before we go on, the thing to note first off is that RU was given less time to work, the 4-month mark, and Finasteride had 6 months to work, and RU still significantly outperformed it. The 0.5% solution of RU showed a very weak effect, expectedly, and placebo induced no effect. So hair regrowth was observed in varying degrees with both agents. RU58841 5% induced the most growth after only 2 months of treatment. Plasma RU in metabolites 10 to 20 nanograms per milliliter were detected in 2 cases of 5% at 3 and 1 at 6 months. So basically assessing how systemic it went. So people want to know, does RU go systemic when it's topically applied? In this model, in the animal model, which is fairly contradictory to some of the other clinical data, we can see that at the 3-month mark, 2 of the animals had detectable metabolites, and only 1 of them did at the 6-month mark. So the fact that less of them had metabolites detectable 3 months with even further dosing kind of elucidates the half-life of this stuff, in my opinion. Like, if it was a cumulative thing and that was building up, you'd have either the same amount of animals showing the detectable metabolites, or there would be more of them. as you would expect after an additional 3 months of consecutive dosing. So basically what it's showing here is that the RU half-life is short, in my opinion, and it's not very... The likelihood of it going systemic is low, and if it does go systemic, it's in a minimal amount relative to if you took an oral anti-androgen or something. And this is, also why some people do get anti-androgen side effects from topical anti-androgens, is some people do get it fairly, a little bit systemic, and that systemic activity it's a very strong anti-androgen. So if it gets systemic, expectedly it's going to do what it's supposed to do. So as far as systemic hormone levels, serum DHT decreased about 70% with finasteride, and testosterone increased with finasteride but exhibited no significant changes with RU. So because there was no significant changes with RU in hormone levels, this kind of further solidifies the fact that it doesn't go systemic very easily, and even if it does, it's to a minimal degree, because if it was going systemic to a significant degree, it would act very similarly to what you see with other non-steroidal anti-androgens that are used orally, like bicalutamide, whereby they occupy AR essentially and increase, serum hormone levels in the body, because those hormones can't essentially dock at androgen receptors and transcribe their effect in tissues. So RU doesn't, go systemic very much, if at all, and if it does, it's in a minority of the subjects. But notable, it can still. But in this model, it was not to a significant enough degree in the minority of rodents that did have it go systemic, where it would even influence hormone levels whatsoever. Serum DHT, as expected, goes down 70% with finasteride and increases testosterone. So the reason the testosterone goes up is because when testosterone is hitting 5-alpha reductase, if it's inhibited by finasteride, the testosterone, in layman's terms, can't convert to DHT, so now it's left as test that would have otherwise been converted to that DHT. So you have more testosterone remaining as testosterone because it can't be converted via that enzymatic process, because there's an inhibitor preventing it. So that's why testosterone goes up with finasteride. So the RU and finasteride reduce systemic production of DHT and local AR block induced regrowth of regressed follicles in the bald scalp assessed in this clinical study. So although finasteride induced a marked decrease of DHT remaining, or that produced by finasteride resistant reductase type 1, still contributed to a certain degree of follicular regression. So as you would expect, this is why people use dutasteride often when finasteride just doesn't cut it for them in terms of a hair loss prevention context, is even if you're using a 5 milligram dose like ProScar, the 5 milligram full dose, you're only crushing systemic DHT by 70%. There's a residual 30% there that's being totally unaccounted for. And then on top of that, you still have all the testosterone and that massive spike in scalp testosterone that is being unaccounted for as well. So that's where, the therapeutic promise of topical anti-androgens in general, selective androgen receptor modulators, things of that nature come into play and can provide a compounding protection when needed, or potentially monotherapy if sufficient. So since testosterone and DHT share the same receptor, so the androgen receptor, a locally sufficient dose of AR blocker, androgen receptor blocker, appears to suppress testosterone and DHT-induced follicular regression more effectively than reductase inhibition. So what that means is something that can bind to the androgen receptor, like a non-steroidal anti-androgen like RU that has a high enough binding affinity that prevents testosterone and DHT from binding and transcribing their effects, is more effective than something that just inhibits 5-alpha reductase, because of the reason I just outlined, whereby you inhibit 5-alpha reductase, and even if you totally crush your DHT with dutasteride, which I've shown in videos before my experiments with dutasteride where I crushed my DHT to undetectable levels, like lower than like a female child, and I would still experience the progression of male pattern baldness. And it was because you have all this testosterone unaccounted for, which is inherently androgenic, just to a far lesser extent than DHT. So not only do you have residual DHT if you're using finasteride instead of dutasteride, but you have a the androgen receptor needs to be accounted for. You can't just inhibit 5-alpha reductase and expect complete protection for life. That's, you can get significant attenuation of androgenic alopecia progression. However, permanent prevention can only be achieved by addressing the AR itself, in my opinion, unless you're like very not prone and like you're like on the borderline of what you would see somebody who's like almost hair loss resistance. And typically those individuals can stave off loss for, a couple decades with just finasteride, like a low dose of it. So, it's obviously individual dependent at the end of the day. It has to do with androgen receptor density, the literal amount of hormones in your system circulating, a myriad of factors. But at the end of the day, like regardless of how aggressive your hair loss is, prevention is mediated via the AR. So like there's other means to reduce the androgen load on your body, like with a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. But the ultimate, target of these androgens is the androgen receptor, whereby they consequently transcribe their effects that results in your follicles being miniaturized to begin with. So, the most efficacious treatment would focus on the AR as either a monotherapy or an adjunct treatment to contribute to, the protection you get with finasteride or dutasteride or whatever else you're using, because there's obviously a myriad of different options. Those are just the traditional, like frontline ones that are like FDA approved. So that's sort of why I'm outlining the comparison to begin with. But as far as like my personal stance, I sort of kind of injected my personal stance into, as I was going through this, I just realized. So I don't think I need to elaborate that much further, but it's not about which one is better than the other, because they have two totally different mechanisms of action. Like finasteride, like I mentioned, inhibits 5-alpha reductase, so you significantly drop your androgen load to whatever extent you inhibit your DHT. Like DHT is the dominating androgenic hormone in the body, so obviously finasteride is very effective, as is dutasteride, which even further drops the androgen load. But what's often unaccounted for, like I mentioned, is that concurrent spike in scalp testosterone, because you have all that testosterone that would have turned to DHT. It doesn't just disappear, it stays as testosterone, it can't convert. So you have to account for that. And if you look at the clinical data on finasteride and dutasteride, there's always a simultaneous spike in scalp testosterone levels when DHT goes down. It's not like it just, disappears into thin air. And this is where some individuals actually run into problems that actually get regression with 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. And that's a topic I should cover another time in its own dedicated video, whereby some individuals who are have extremely aggressive hair loss actually get worse when they induce this spike in scalp T. So that's where, again, the androgen receptor is like the target and like the sort of like the start of this entire cascade of events that leads to the androgenic alopecia. So ideal treatment choices would be centered around ensuring AR activation is, totally accounted for. And it's not just somebody who's, I'll take, finasteride, minoxidil, and dermarol and use ketoconazole shampoo, like the big three. That works pretty well for staving off hair loss for 5-10 years if you're not that prone. For some individuals, it's not going to do anything if you have very aggressive loss. But, for the people who want total prevention and for those with very aggressive loss, you need to focus on the AR in some capacity, whether it be via anti-androgens, whether it be through SARMs, whether it be through more tissue-selective androgens themselves. There are different ways to go about this. But again, as far as what's better than what, finasteride versus RU, neither are better than another. If anything, they would be something to use. Some individuals with very, very, mild hair loss will achieve prevention with, just RU or just finasteride. They'll be able to stave off further progression for, a couple decades. But at the end of the day, these are things that should be looked at as how can they compound the protection of one another, not necessarily which one's better than the other. And you have to keep in mind too, the dose, there's dose dependent response with all drugs for the most part until you hit a diminishing returns effect. So just because you have a 5% solution of RU working well in this clinical study, or for, Joe Blow down the street that uses RU, or whoever you're comparing yourself to, it doesn't mean that your circulating androgen levels can be totally accounted for with just, a 5% RU solution applied, 2 milliliters a day or something. Like for you, first of all, the DHT binding affinity is higher than RU by a significant amount. If anything, RU is slightly better than testosterone, if not, equal to. It's definitely not higher than DHT though. So the fact that it's such a short half-life, if you have a significant amount of DHT in your body, the likelihood that you're going to be able to totally prevent further progression with just one of those as your monotherapy is very low in my opinion. So that's why, where something like a 5-AR inhibitor would sort of come in to assist it, whereby you crush the androgen load a significant amount by getting rid of the DHT that the RU or the CB has a hard time handling, and then it just has to clean up the excess of T that it can actually take care of because it has a formidable binding affinity. Now CB has a much, much, much worse binding affinity. That's why I feel like RU is a more efficacious treatment option. However, the same strategy applies. Like CB could potentially be more than sufficient if you had like a simultaneous adjunct 5-AR inhibitor in play or something like that. So that's just, like the mainstream sort of me addressing this comparison. So these are like very, like obviously CB and RU aren't like mainstream treatment options, but they're more mainstream than some of the other more stuff I would get into if I was to discuss like very aggressive regimens for those who are very prone. But for the vast majority of people, like addressing 5-AR and addressing the AR with something like with a high tolerability like these is a very good beginning option in my opinion. So take from that what you will. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplatesmoredates.com. And especially if you want to see like organized versions of these videos, I sort of just talk off the cuff and it can be hard to follow, but I always, if I have an article to go along with the video, and I typically will if it's something I deem important enough information to have an article to go along with it, I'll always chop down the video into like concise subsections with clinical studies linked for you guys to delve into further if you want to check them out yourself. Have a table of contents. Everything's like neatly laid out for you in a more palatable format rather than me just rambling. So if you want to do that and check out those articles and get them sent to you right when they're published, I highly recommend you subscribe to the newsletter, which is the first link in the video description below. And right when I publish an article to go along with the video, it'll get sent to you in your email. And there's a lot of incentive to do that because none of the studies I mentioned, none of the data I mentioned, none of anything I mentioned gets put in the video. It's not like you can just click a hyperlink here that shows this like study I'm looking at and this kind of like reference to this data point and this, statistic of how much scalp T spikes when you use a 5-AR inhibitor and whatnot. Like that kind of stuff is included in the articles. So highly recommend you subscribe to that. Follow me on Instagram at moreplates_moredates, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, BitChute, TikTok, anything else I'm on, the podcast, iTunes, etc. Talk to you guys soon.